This morning, 3 million Israelis turned on their taps. Nothing came out. Not a trickle. Not reduced pressure. Nothing. For the first time in the modern history of one of the most technologically advanced nations on Earth, a country that pioneered drip irrigation, that turned desert into farmland, that built a water technology industry worth billions of dollars and exported it to 50 nations, the taps ran dry. Because at 03:47 local time, Iran struck the Sorek 2 desalination facility, Israel's largest operational water treatment plant, responsible for supplying approximately 35% of the country's total drinking water, with a coordinated missile and drone strike that Israeli engineers are now describing as the most precisely targeted infrastructure attack in this conflict's history. This was not collateral damage. This was not a military installation that happened to be near a civilian water source. Iran looked at Israel's water infrastructure map, identified the single facility whose destruction would cause maximum civilian suffering at minimum military cost, and hit it with everything it had. In episodes 1, 2, and 3 of this series, we watched Iran escalate from precision ballistic missiles over Tel Aviv, to shutting down Ben Gurion Airport, to drowning Israeli air defenses in a Shahed 136 drone swarm. Each strike was more sophisticated than the last. Each one targeted a different pillar of Israeli society. Tonight, Iran targeted the most fundamental pillar of all, water. And when water stops, everything stops. Welcome to Geopolitics Meets Money. Let's get into exactly what just happened, and what it means for Israel, for the region, and for the global economy. To understand the full strategic weight of tonight's strike, you need to understand what Sorek 2 actually is, and why its destruction is categorically more destabilizing than anything Iran has done in this conflict so far. Israel is a desert country. Roughly 60% of its landmass receives less than 200 millimeters of rainfall per year, the internationally accepted threshold for arid conditions. The country has no major rivers. The Sea of Galilee, its primary natural freshwater reservoir, has been in structural decline for decades. Israel solved this existential problem through desalination, the process of stripping salt from Mediterranean seawater to produce drinking water at industrial scale. Today, Israel's desalination network supplies approximately 80% of the country's domestic drinking water. Sorek 2, located on the Mediterranean coast south of Tel Aviv, is the crown jewel of that network. Operational since 2023, it uses advanced reverse osmosis technology to process 200 million cubic meters of fresh water annually, enough to supply the daily water needs of approximately 3 million people. It is the largest desalination facility in the world outside of the Arabian Gulf states. It cost $1.5 billion to build. It took Iran 4 ballistic missiles and 11 Shahed 136 drones to render it non-operational. The strike was executed in 2 phases. The first wave, 2 Khorramshahr 4 missiles, targeted the facility's primary high-pressure pump arrays. These are the mechanical heart of a reverse osmosis plant, arrays of industrial pumps that force seawater at extreme pressure through membranes fine enough to filter individual salt ions. Destroy the pump arrays, and the membranes are useless. Sorek 2's pump hull took a direct hit. The secondary pump array, installed as a redundancy measure, took the second missile. Both were destroyed. The second wave, 11 Shahed 136 drones arriving 4 minutes later, targeted the facility's electrical substation, its backup generator complex, and the main pipeline junction connecting Sorek 2 to the national water distribution grid. Even if Israeli engineers could somehow repair the pump arrays overnight, there is no power to run them and no intact pipeline to carry the water if they could. Iran did not just damage Sorek 2, it performed surgical destruction, taking out every redundant system in sequence so that no single repair could restore even partial function. But here is where Iran's strategic calculation contains a flaw that its planners almost certainly did not model. Targeting civilian water infrastructure does not demoralize a population with Israel's psychological history. It radicalizes it. Within 2 hours of the strike becoming public, the Israeli government declared a national water emergency, the first in the country's 76-year history. Emergency distribution centers were established across Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jerusalem, and Beersheba within 90 minutes, drawing on strategic water reserves held in underground cisterns that Israel has quietly maintained precisely because its military planners always understood that water was a target. Those reserves provide approximately 18 days of drinking water at reduced civilian consumption rates. 18 days is not a crisis. 18 days is a countdown, and Israel's government has 18 days to restore at least partial desalination capacity before the strategic reserve runs dry. The Israeli Defense Forces, meanwhile, had a different response entirely. Within 30 minutes of the Sorek 2 strike, the IDF's northern, central, and southern commands simultaneously moved to elevated readiness. Not because the water plant was a military asset, because its targeting represented Iran's explicit declaration that civilian infrastructure, hospitals, power grids, schools, and water supplies, was now fair game. and Israel's rules of engagement had just changed accordingly. Israel's first response was not directed at missile silos or drone factories. It was directed at the men who planned tonight's strike. Unit 8200 had been tracking the targeting cell responsible for mapping Israel's critical civilian infrastructure for 11 months. A dedicated IRGC intelligence organization unit, operating from a facility embedded within the Imam Hussein University complex in eastern Tehran, a location deliberately chosen to complicate Israeli strike authorization, had spent nearly a year building a precision targeting database of Israel's water, power, and communications infrastructure. That database was the most dangerous weapon Iran used tonight, more dangerous than the Khorramshahr 4, more dangerous than the Shahed swarm, because a targeting database is reusable. The missiles can be replaced. But a year of intelligence work, the coordinates, the redundancy maps, the vulnerability assessments, is irreplaceable if the people who built it are gone. At 05:15 local time, F-35I Adirs struck the Imam Hussein University targeting facility with Rock's long-range missiles, destroying the building's primary server infrastructure and killing 11 members of the IRGC targeting cell. A second strike, timed 11 minutes later, hit the secure communications relay they used to transmit targeting coordinates to launch crews, the same relay architecture that Unit 8200 had identified during the Shahed swarm investigation in Episode 3. The targeting cell is gone. Its database is destroyed. Iran's ability to execute this level of precision infrastructure targeting has been set back by an estimated 2 to 3 years. Phase 2 of Israel's response addressed the vulnerability that tonight's strike had exposed in its most direct form, the fact that Israel's desalination network had no meaningful military protection. That changes now. Israeli defense officials announced the immediate deployment of dedicated Iron Dome batteries to guard each of Israel's 5 remaining operational desalination facilities: Ashkelon, Hadera, Palmakim, Ashdod, and the partially operational Sorek 1 plant adjacent to the destroyed Sorek 2 site. Each battery was accompanied by a dedicated radar installation and a ground security perimeter, converting civilian water infrastructure into defended military assets overnight. Simultaneously, the United States announced an emergency engineering deployment. 340 U.S. Army Corps of Engineers specialists, pre-positioned in Cyprus as part of a broader regional contingency plan that the Pentagon has clearly been developing in parallel with Israel's military campaign, were activated and began airlift operations to Israel within 4 hours of the strike. Their mission? Emergency repair of Sorek 2's secondary systems to restore at least 30% of operational capacity within 14 days, before the strategic water reserve runs dry, 14 days. The engineering timeline and the reserve timeline are identical. There is no margin for error. This is where geopolitics meets money arrives. At a number that should stop every investor, every agricultural trader, and every emerging market analyst watching this video cold. Israel's agricultural sector, which produces $4.7 billion in annual export value, supplies 95% of the country's own food requirements, and is built almost entirely on precision irrigation systems fed by desalinated water. It faces complete operational collapse within 30 days if Sorek 2 is not repaired or replaced. Israeli agricultural exports, including $1.2 billion in fresh produce annually to European markets, halted immediately as irrigation systems across the Negev and coastal plain were shut down to preserve remaining water reserves for human consumption. European supermarket chains that source Israeli cherry tomatoes, peppers, and avocados, products that dominate shelf space in German, Dutch, and British grocery retail, are already activating alternative supplier contracts in Morocco, Turkey, and Spain. Israeli water technology stocks, companies like IDE Technologies, Mekarat, and the publicly listed desalination equipment manufacturers that together represent a significant component of the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange's industrial index, collapsed between 22% and 41% at open, as investors priced in both physical destruction of assets and the reputational damage of Israel's flagship water technology sector being visibly defeated on its home soil. Globally, the humanitarian optics of 3 million people without drinking water triggered an emergency UN Security Council session within 6 hours, the first formal international institutional response since this escalation began. The session produced no resolution. It produced no ceasefire mechanism. But it produced something potentially more consequential for Iran's long-term position. A unified Western narrative framing Iran not as a military adversary, but as a regime deliberately targeting civilian water supplies. That framing, war crime language, not military language, opens doors to sanctions escalation, asset freezes, and diplomatic isolation that ballistic missile exchanges alone do not. Here is the question. Geopolitics meets money is sitting with tonight, and it is the hardest one we have asked in this entire series. Iran has now struck in sequence a civilian city center, a civilian airport, a civilian power and radar network, and a civilian water supply. Each strike has been more infrastructurally targeted than the last. Each one has imposed costs that are not measured in military casualties, but in economic collapse, civilian suffering, and institutional confidence. This is not a military campaign anymore. This is a deliberate, methodical dismantling of the conditions that make a modern society function. And here is what that means for the endgame. Because every war has one. Israel can rebuild a runway. It can restock interceptor missiles. It can repair a desalination plant. But it cannot indefinitely absorb the cumulative economic weight of closed airports, drained interceptor magazines, collapsed agricultural exports, and 3 million people on emergency water rations, while simultaneously funding one of the most expensive military campaigns in its history. Iran knows this. The strikes are not random. They are a carefully sequenced exhaustion strategy, designed by people who have studied exactly how much economic pressure a democratic society can absorb before its population demands a negotiated exit. So here is what we are putting to the GMM community today. Has Iran just crossed the line that forces Western nations to intervene directly, turning water infrastructure targeting into a war crimes case that changes the international rules of engagement? Or is Israel's 18-day water clock just handed Tehran the leverage it has been building toward all along, a ticking countdown that forces Jerusalem to the negotiating table on Iran's terms? Drop your answer below. And in our next episode, we are going to the number that nobody in the mainstream financial press is talking about yet, the total cumulative economic cost of this four-strike campaign on Israel's GDP, its sovereign credit rating, and what happens to its $50 billion tech sector if this continues for another 30 days. This is Geopolitics Meets Money. Stay sharp.